This video should get you through the second week of taxonomy in the lab. We're going to be talking about plants, so it's fairly brief. There's going to be a handout posted in Blackboard again. It starts like this, and then you got a table kind of like last week. It's just a little bit shorter because it's all about plants this time. We're going to start with the fill in the blank stuff, so I'm going to go ahead and switch over to full screen on this. So it says to know the selected flower parts on figure 24.8.1 and tables 24.8.1. In your lab manual, it gives you a standard picture of a flower. That's what it's talking about here, where you have to know the calyx, the corolla, the sepals, and petals. You have to know the male parts of a flower are stamens, and each stamen consists of an anther and a filament. And then you have to know that the female part is, it used to be called the pistil. Usually that's what they call it in high school, but now it's called a carpel. The carpel has three parts, the stigma, the style, and the ovary, and that's the female part of the flower. The table just kind of describes in a little bit more detail what each one of those parts do. After that, you've got a few little terms that we're going to talk about on later slides. So this is the model that we usually use to discuss this stuff, and using the picture that's in your lab manual, the receptacle is this swollen part at the top of the stem, which is called a petiole when you're talking about a flower. So this is the receptacle. That leads you to the calyx. The sepals are what make up the calyx, and so this particular calyx consists of two sepals, this one and then this one. Next up you have the corolla. The corolla is all the petals, and so this flower is showing you three petals that are kind of pink with little veins that run down them. So calyx is sepals, corolla is petals. Next up you have the male part of the flower, which is the stamen. The anther is the part that makes the pollen, and then the filament is what supports the anther and holds it up high. Then the carpel is the female part. The stigma is sticky and pollen likes to stick to that. The pollen then drills a pollen tube through the style, and then eventually that pollen tube is going to allow the sperm and the pollen to hit the ovule, which is the white part in this model. So those are the parts of a flower. Make sure you spend some time studying those because there will be pictures of the model on the test. This is just some other pictures to show you what's up with the flower, and then it's going to take us to some terms. So complete versus incomplete has to do with all the parts. If all the parts are there, there's a calyx, there's a corolla, there's stamens, and there's at least one carpel, it's a complete flower. If it's missing any of those parts, it's an incomplete flower. Then, for perfect and imperfect, this is about sexual reproduction again. If it's perfect, it's a hermaphrodite. It has both male and female structures. And so as you look at this picture up here at the top, it's got a stamen, it's got a carpel. Since it has both of those, this is a perfect flower. By default, if you have a complete flower, it has to be a perfect flower. Next up, if it's missing any of the male or female parts, then it's an imperfect flower. So notice that this one, it has the carpel, but it doesn't have any of the stamens to it, so it's missing the male parts. So this is an imperfect plant. By default, imperfect plants have to be incomplete flowers. So this is just the stamens that are visible on this one. So this would be, I only see the stamens. I don't really see a lot else in terms of carpels inside of there, so that would make this an imperfect flower. Next up, there's going to be two major groups of plants, monocots and dicots. You can tell the difference about them based on a number of different factors. So they're named based on how many cotyledons they have. A cotyledon is a seed leaf, so monocots have one cotyledon or seed leaf, and dicots have two. But there's other things that you can see too. So parallel leaf veins, that's going to be like the veins in a leaf that you would find on a blade of grass, for example. Those are monocots. If the veins branch out and go in multiple directions, that would be a dicot. If you can see the flower, you can count how many petals there are. If it's in multiples of 3, it's a monocot. If it's in multiples of 2, 4, or 5, it's a dicot. The other stuff, you'd have to pick them out to see them, but if they have fibrous roots, they tend to be monocots, and a big taproot like a carrot tends to be a dicot. Alright, so as you look at these, this is just to show you what was up from the previous slide. So you can see that this flower has 6 petals. That's a multiple of 3. That's going to tend to make this a monocot. In addition, to support that, we've got parallel veins where all the veins run down the same direction in the leaf. So parallel veins is monocot, and then fibrous roots is monocot. As you look at this one on the other side, it's got 5 petals to it. 2s, 4s, or 5s is a dicot, so that's dicot. The veins in the leaf, they have one main vein that goes down the end, and then the other ones branch off. That's called net or branching venation. That's typical of dicots. And then one main root, that's a taproot. So this is your dicot example. This is your monocot example. Okay, I'm going to back out of here for just a second because we've filled in all of this stuff. Next up, we're back in the table. Everything we're going to talk about today is all in the kingdom Plantae. So you can put it in that top box and then quotation marks all the way down. Characteristics for plants. They're eukaryotic. They're almost all photosynthetic. There are some exceptions to that rule. And they are sessile. All sessile means is they don't get up and walk around. That'd be kind of creepy if they did. So those are the characteristics going up here, and they already put the quotation marks in the box that goes below that. From here we're going to start getting into phylum and then characteristics of those phyla, and so we're going to move down and we're going to talk about Neem next. The M is usually silent, so Neem is in the phylum Bryophyta. You're going to put that here in this box. The characteristics. This is the simplest group of plants. They don't have flowers, they don't have fruits, they don't make seeds, and they don't have vascular tissue. And so the lack of vascular tissue is what you're going to put in there. We're just going to keep going on this part, so I'm going to go ahead and flip us back to full screen on this. So there's Neem up close. These plants are actually really tiny. You can find them outside right now. If you see like really small green mossy stuff, that's a bryophyte. It's Neem usually, and so you can find that outside. Okay. Lycophyta, or Lycopodium is your example. It's in the phylum Lycophyta. This is your club moss. We don't have a lot of this in our area in Texas, but if you go towards the swampier East Texas side, you can start to find more of this. They still don't have the vascular tissue or any of the other stuff that the other plants that are later are going to have. They just get to be a little bit bigger, and so this is what Lycophyta looks like. Sphenophyta, this is your horsetails, so Equisetum is horsetails. We do get these in Texas. They tend to look more like this picture in Texas than they do this one. These are sometimes called scouring rushes. I don't know if any of you are campers, but if you camp next to rivers or lakes, people will often like grab some of these and use them to scour their pans or clean their pans. That's why they're called scouring rushes. They usually grow to be about hip height on me in our area, and so this is a horsetail. Next up, we've got ferns and polypodium. These guys have leaves that most people would recognize as leaves. This is the back side of the leaf. This is back. This is the front side. When it says the characteristic for the pteridophyta is they have sporangia, these little brown discs that you see on the back of the leaf, that's the sporangia. And what the sporangia does is it makes spores, which is not the same thing as a seed, but if a spore lands in a good suitable place, it can germinate and make a plant. And so that's characteristic of this group. They have those sporangia. Next up, you have cycads. You can find these planted. They don't grow naturally, but a lot of people use them as ornamentals in our area. They're super pokey. They suck if you fall on them. These are starting to get more advanced. They do have vascular tissue, but they still don't flower or fruit, and they don't, excuse me, they don't do what like the angiosperms are going to do a little bit later on. The other side note is if you do decide you want to plant these in your yard, they don't do well in freezes. You have to cover them up or they'll die in a freeze. So that's why you'll see these covered up with like sheets and garbage bags and stuff in the wintertime. Next up, phylum Coniferophyta. This is your conifers. Conifers are anything that produces a cone, like a pine tree, a cedar tree, and then the giant redwoods off over here. This is our first group that does have seeds. It does still have vascular tissue. These do produce cones, like a pine cone. That's why they're called Coniferophytas. However, they don't flower and they don't produce fruits. Around here, we tend to be mostly cedar trees, but you can find pine trees in our area too. In fact, there's some on campus. Next little section, I'm going to back out again because they have a little section in here to talk about the cones that pine trees actually have. There's 3 different types of cones that they want you guys to be able to recognize, and the first one is going to be staminate cone. We're not putting classes or anything here. We are just going to put the characteristics of what that cone looks like. So for the staminate cone, these are really tiny. They are not woody like the pine cone that you're familiar with. In fact, they're very soft and mushy. If you were to find one and flick it, pollen would come poofing out of the staminate cone because that's what these do. They make pollen. We do have some on the pine trees on campus right around now. It's just that you're not really on campus right now, so you probably won't see those. Because these are so much smaller, you've probably never even noticed them, but they are on pine trees all the time. Next up for ovate pine cones. These are the woody pine cones that you're familiar with. The difference between this and the next cone is that the scales are closed on an ovate pine cone. And so as you look at this one, you can see there's no gaps between the scales that are on there. That's because it's still in the process of producing the seed that's going to come out of here. And so this is the best example of an ovate cone that you're going to see. So female, it has the ovaries on it, and then eventually it's going to be what makes the seeds. After that, Mature cone is the one that opens up all the scales so that the seeds can actually come out. And so this is the mature pine cone that makes for a wonderful weapon. If you have a brother or sister, you can chuck them at each other because they're actually really pokey and they can kind of suck. Next up, we're going to move down to lily, and so we're just going to fill this out, but we're going to have all the way across. We're going to have a phylum and then characteristics for this group, and then we're going to have the class and the characteristics for the lilies specifically. So I'm going to go back to full screen here. So your lilies and your beans are in the Anthophyta group. This is the flowering plants. And so anything that does make a flower is in this group, even if the flower's not showy. Like if grass does flower, it just has the most boring flower known to man, so nobody pays any attention to them. This group does enclose the seed in a fruit, and so not only does it make flowers, but it makes fruits as well. Next, for the lily, it's in the class Monocotyledonnae. It's a monocot. So all those characteristics we mentioned earlier, parallel veins, fibrous roots, flower parts in multiples of 3, that applies to this group right here. And so the lily is the classic example of that, and I'll show you a picture of what that looks like now. So this is a lily, think Easter lily. It's got 6 petals. These don't do sepals, so it's an incomplete flower, but it is perfect because it has both a carpel and stamens. And so this is that weird combination of it's incomplete because it's missing the sepals, but it's still perfect because it has both of the reproductive structures. This plant has multiple names. Kind of caustically, it's called wandering Jew. So you might have heard your grandparents call it that, but people are trying to switch the name over to purple heart to make it a little bit more of a nice name as opposed to, I don't know, a slanderous one. Notice flower parts in multiples of 3, so it's a monocot. This is a spider plant. It's a very common house plant that a lot of people have inside their homes. Next, your bean, I believe, is what they put in the table for you guys, is a dicot, so Dicotyledonnae. So all the characteristics we mentioned earlier, flower parts in multiples of 2, 4, or 5, net venation, taproot, that is going to be what's in this group. Roses are in here. So roses in their natural state have 5 petals, so they're satisfying that 2s, 4s, or 5s. This is a bean plant that's first starting to sprout. This is just a pansy. It has flower parts in multiples of 5, so all of these are examples of dicots. You can also see in all these pictures net venation, net venation, net venation to the leaves that go for that, and so that's one of the other characteristics that help you recognize a dicot. So from here, I'm going to be posting a Taxonomy 2 quiz in Blackboard. Make sure you take that. It's going to be timed just like the Taxonomy 1 quiz was. Good luck.